So, Mr. Tudorache, thank you. So Elaine Burke is the chair of our panel today, and I'm delighted to introduce her. So Elaine is a celebrated journalist and broadcaster known for her clear and engaging commentary on science and technology. As Ireland AM's resident tech expert and a weekly analyst on Today FM's The Last Word, she makes complex topics accessible. It's no surprise to anyone that in 2022 she received the inaugural Women in Business Journalism Award, and I'm delighted to introduce Elaine to chair the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Olivia. So I'm going to waste no time in introducing our panelists and welcome them to join us up here. So Dragos needs no further introduction, I'm sure. But we also have Emma Redmond, Associate General Counsel and Head of Privacy and Data Protection at OpenAI. She was formerly Global Head of Privacy at Stripe, was Head of International Data Protection at both Ancestry and LinkedIn. And she's also an Adjunct Associate Professor of Law at University College Dublin and is a member of the Irish Government's AI Advisory Council. We also have Medb Corcoran, Managing Director of Accenture Labs in Ireland, an applied R&D hub focused on AI and bioinnovation. She also leads Accenture's bioinnovation incubation teams globally, overseeing projects across life sciences, health, and CPG, which is consumer packaged goods for anyone who is confused by those acronyms. And Professor Dave Lewis, who many of you will know. And Dave is an Associate Professor at the School of Computer Science and Statistics at Trinity College Dublin and the head of its Artificial Intelligence discipline. He's also Deputy Director of the ADAPT SFI Research Centre. ADAPT, we know what ADAPT is now, and leads ADAPT's programme of industry collaborative research and its multidisciplinary research theme on data governance. His own research focuses on the use of open semantic models to manage the data protection and data ethics issues associated with digital content processing. So that's our panel, and I'm going to start with you, Dragos. You haven't spoken enough yet this morning, I suppose. 4 years to write the AI Act. Do you think you could have done it faster with ChatGPT? That's a joke. My real question is, we have that timeline of implementation that you mentioned that can go all the way up to 3 years from now. But to get people's heads around it and its impact, if it was in place now, what kind of impact do you think it would have? And that's a big question, so a bit of context around that. We currently have, Meta has had to pull back a plan to use platforms like Instagram and Facebook to train its AI model here in the EU. And that was based on complaints under GDPR. So the Data Protection Council here in Ireland has asked for a pause on that. So there is overlap there. GDPR can actually be used when it comes to this kind of data processing side of things. But what if the AI Act was in place there? Would there be any powers in that context?
Well, depends on whether we consider apparel the fact that a company like Meta or others would have to think twice before putting a product on the market, because they'll have to think, am I complying with the regulation or not? From that point of view, yes. What is required now with the AI Act being around is that companies, particularly those that, not particularly, those that are going to be subjects of this law, are going to have to think, am I compliant or not? What do I need to do in terms of my training runs? What do I need to do in terms of the transparency that I'm required to now comply with? What do I need to do in terms of explainability? What kind of documentation do I need to start putting together? So if the AI Act would be enforced today, for sure, for those companies that would be subjects of the law, it will take time and work to make sure that they comply. That is why we have given 2 years of implementation, so that they also, from a mindset point of view, they get to grips with the new reality and also start preparing, not slowly, I think it's not the right word, but gradually for the moment of implementation. What we have done to simplify this task and to also reduce the costs of that task, particularly for the smaller companies who have been very much at the forefront of our thinking during the negotiations, was to do self-regulation. In the sense of you self-assess yourself. You self-assess to see, am I compliant or not? And then the question with self-assessment is, but is it clear enough? I'm a small startup of 3 people in a garage. What do I know of reading a law? What did I know about reading GDPR? Nothing. But GDPR didn't have standards. One of the mistakes from my point of view with GDPR is that it did not have a mandate for technical standards. Now we do. So by the time the regulation will come into effect, by the time the small startup in a garage will have to self-assess, There'll also be technical standards that will help the 3 engineer band in the garage to understand how to look at their application and decide whether am I in the category of risk or not. And then if they are still not, if they are still not certain, they've done their self-assessment, they looked at the standards, they scratched their heads, well, I'm borderline. I'm doing AI in one of the areas that are listed as high risk. It's recruitment, it's health, it's education. I'm not sure. You have the sandbox. So you go free of charge if you're an SME. You go to the sandbox, you face the regulator, as I said, ideally not a bureaucrat, someone who speaks your language, and says, listen, I have this, but I want to validate, revalidate my assumptions. I want to retest with you to make sure, have I self-assessed myself correctly or not? Have I prepared myself correctly for compliance? So we've put all of these enablers in the text to understand that, yes, compliance always comes with a cost. It would be foolish to say it doesn't, but to make that burden as light as we can, looking also at what GDPR meant, not necessarily in the good sense, for many of our companies out there.
And then Emma, for a company like OpenAI, obviously it's going to have a huge impact there. What are the gradual steps that you have to take? And is it going to mean some drastic changes in how OpenAI operates? Because there's also obviously elements there of the transparency that's needed around training data and stuff like that. But there's the self-assessment side of it. You're obviously going to have to conduct like impact assessments, all sorts of things coming on there. But I'm wondering more specifically what kind of change it will mean for OpenAI.
Yeah, so is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'd say we're lucky in terms of where we came from. So maybe if I go back to prior to 30th of November 2022, when ChatGPT was made available, which frankly surprised us in terms of the take-up. But prior to that time, we were founded as a research lab. And so like any state of play when you're dealing with researchers or scientists of any kind, you know, they're you know, by default, you know, well, log findings, well, log reports, etc. And so for us, well prior to November 2022, we were, and don't use the term fine-tuned, but we were fine-tuned ourselves to actually create that documentation because that's what we always did. And it's out there for you to take a look at. You know, there's so many system cards out there, model cards, blogs, etc. So much, and it's upon us as well to do even better in terms of educating in that respect. So I think in that respect we are lucky because that's always been there. And so it's incumbent upon us to even draw on that even more as a result of the Act. And I think part of that as well is also ensuring that we continuously talk to stakeholders, to others in industry, to civil society, to governments, etc., to make sure that you know, we're ahead of the game in terms of you know, in terms of the requirements there. The other thing I will say is in terms of stepping up, you know, for anyone out there who's part of the GDPR privacy program, I do think it's important to give yourself a pat on the back for everything that's been achieved for the past number of years, because that shouldn't be underestimated in terms of what GDPR has done. Quite phenomenal, actually, and it's really kind of coming into its own now. And so, as Dragos mentioned, you know, it's kind of taking that up like 10 times in terms of a level now. But there's that muscle memory that's there as a result of GDPR that can really, you know, you can use those teams that you have already there to bring that up. And that's certainly, you know, we're busy in that respect in terms of our teams, right? And, you know, I think across many companies, you know, data protection teams are getting the recognition they always deserved, but probably even more so as a result of the AI Act in that respect. So I think, you know, I suppose it's easier for us to be able to say that because of where we came from as a research lab and in terms of the muscle memory that we have. But I think for companies generally, of course, it's going to be a change. Of course, there's going to be a different wow ways of working and ways of thinking about things. But as you had mentioned, it's about from the wow to the how. And so there's going to be a lot to do as regards listening and understanding as things come out over the next while.
And as things develop as well, I mean, it's like no secret that, you know, big companies are going to be lobbying for changes when it comes to this legislation, and maybe even pushing back when enforcement comes. Because we've seen that with GDPR, and we will see the same patterns play out here, I'm sure. And as Dragos said, it is a living document, it is evolving, it is going to try and keep step with the industry. In its current form, are there sticking points that you have at OpenAI or changes that you would like to see as the act evolves?
You know, I think like any piece of legislation, it all has its place and purpose, right? So I think for us, we're very much, we very much commend the phenomenal work that's been done. I think you almost have to step back for a minute and actually acknowledge the huge amount of work that's been done by Dragos and the team, and it's really quite phenomenal. And so right now we're very much, you know, in listening mode, really kind of engaging with so many stakeholders across the board to really kind of see what that means at the moment.
And Maeve, from your perspective, you're obviously dealing with multiple clients who are probably coming to you with questions about AI and how can they deploy it. And they're probably at this point receiving some mixed messaging, because we hear, oh, companies need to be getting used to this and getting on terms with this so that they understand the future and that they're future-proofing themselves. But also be careful, because there's this legislation coming along the line, no one really understands it and you don't know what to do with it. And if you're working with a third-party supplier, which you probably need to do because you haven't built anything yourself, you also don't know what's going to happen to them and how their models are going to have to change now. So it's very confusing. How are you dealing with that, and how are you talking clients through this and advising the steps that they take?
Well, so we've had a responsible AI function in Accenture for clients for over 5 years. Like, we worked with AIB back in 2018 to actually put in an algorithmic fairness toolkit for them. So a lot of companies out there have been looking at this and actually want to do the right thing. Most companies do. And actually what the regulation does is allows, like, they have guardrails now. Before, they had to decide themselves what's high risk, how do we quantify how much risk is in our AI systems, and what action do we take? And now they've got guidelines and regulation. In terms of how we're helping clients prepare, I mean, the first thing, there's all different levels of maturity, but the first thing everyone has to do is, if you don't have it already, a list of all AI systems that you have in your organization. And then the next thing is to actually look at the act and rank them in terms of the risk levels. And then once that's done, you can take action on testing, monitoring, and all of that. But they're the first two things that we say to all companies: if you haven't done this yet, this is what you have to do now.
And I'm definitely going to come back to you on the work you guys have done in responsible AI. But since you've given me a perfect segue, I'm going to move to you, Dave, because at Adapt, you guys are working on tools that can help businesses to get their heads around the regulation coming down the way with AI. Can you explain some of those tools?
Yeah, sure. For us, we see this as a beginning of a big, if you like, continent-wide learning experience we have to go through. Drago, you talked about how the politicians had to learn a lot about AI, and now with the regulation, we're going to have to do that at a very broad scale. So I think be able to communicate our experiences between companies, for example, I think in the first instance, public authorities that are procuring AI systems and the companies that are involved in those procurement activities. That's going to be one of the areas where these concerns are going to come up very early on. And I think in a way, one of the things actually that I think is interesting in the AI Act is when you look at the high risk areas, the ones that need the extra sort of regulatory activities. They're either things that are already regulated from a health and safety point of view, or they tend to be often things that are functions like education or public services that are conducted by the state. So I think there's I'm sure this is probably deliberate, there's a good intersection between how we develop, our use of IT across the public sector in Europe, how we do that in an interoperability way. So that also interacts, for example, You mentioned some of the other acts, but there's the Interoperable Europe Act as well, which is really encouraging that sort of interoperability. So we're very focused on that. We work a lot with both the international and European technical standards in this area, but also looking at ways where, how can people exchange information about their risk assessments, about their quality management systems, and especially, I think, in the first instance, between public authorities, saying, well, we're all going to very soon, including places like Trinity, we'll have to do perhaps a fundamental rights impact assessment if we're planning to use AI in assessing our students. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to do that by ourselves. We should do that and share that experience with other universities in Ireland and other universities internationally, and that's already starting. So we're very much focused on how can we support that exchange of learnings across different bodies across Europe, and especially, helping the public sector and the way that they interact with their private sector suppliers to exchange that information in a way that we can really look at some of these hard issues about protection, especially fundamental rights, which is a lot of new things we have to learn there.
And is the idea that you are inviting SMEs, big players, all players in the industry to come to you for advice, or are you maybe building tools that they'll be able to access that you'll make available for them to, do maybe a quick check on, here's what my business is, what am I at risk for, what do I need to do?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think both of those. So we obviously do work with industry players, but that's all based on outputs that we're very, very much in line, again, with European research values. We make them available in an open access way, make sure that the resources are findable, interoperable, accessible, reusable. So there's things that we already do in our research that we're applying there. So we're not saying, well, you have to come work with us and pay us some money to learn this. We also build that on a platform that will make it available. So there's some posters that talk about some of the tools that we have in there, like little ready reckoners for determining whether you're high risk or not, based on models that you can then trace back to the AI Act. So it's not trying to replace the legal advice that you definitely need, but it gives you a sort of a quick sort of a ready reckoner to start figuring out whether is this something I have to really be worrying about or not.
And I'm so glad you mentioned, there is a rake of legislation that does actually impinge on this development. It's not just the AI Act. There's so much of the regulation out there. Even GDPR definitely has applications here, which we're all quite familiar with. But you've got Interoperability Act. You've got accessibility standards across the EU. You've also got an EU energy directive, which, as far as I know, is specific on even the temperature range that you can run a server farm at. So that's how specific these things can get. And if you're operating AI models, you're going to have massive server farms. And from the business perspective, Emma and Maeve, I'm wondering, are those concerns being held to as high a regard as the EU AI Act? Because the environmental and physical limitations on this development seem to be a bit of an elephant in the room. We love talking about the potential if everyone was using this. But could everyone be using this with the energy limitations and the environmental concerns around that? And would it even be allowed under the limitations we have there and already existing regulation?
So I can't speak specifically, to that point. What I will say is, certainly for us, obviously that is a criteria that we're looking into from a climate perspective. And again, we're lucky because we have so many teams across the board that are looking at all these different aspects as part of it. And that is also inbuilt to our assessments that are carried out as well. So that is part of it, I will say. But it has to be a consideration. Of course it does, for any provider, not just ourselves, in terms of what's going to be made available to ordinary users as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, within responsible AI, we include sustainability in there. So it's something, I know it's not specifically in the EU AI Act, but it's something that when we're working with clients, we work with them on how they can look at sustainability. I agree, it needs to be, especially with the processing power of AI, it needs to be part of what's thought of. And I think looking to see how much of that can be renewable energy. Obviously, renewable energy, there's more and more coming online, so how much of it can be that? But there's also innovations coming, not in the next year or two, but say quantum computers, when they're big enough, the way they process is quite different than computers today. So actually, that some of these innovations in the longer term may help us with this problem as well.
And then you're going to need supercooling for quantum computers, so probably just more challenges there as well. But I know both yourself and you're through responsible AI programs at Accenture, and Dave, through the work that you do, you are like very much interested in this like ethical version of AI, and it does normally stem around things like biases and things that can be embedded in AI systems. But I mean, we should also be looking at this environmental aspect, because like, I mean, I do have rights to live in an environment that's being kept safe and secure as well, and that is part of my rights as a human being. And I'm just wondering, like, if we are building systems like this and taking up all this energy, and they are maybe using renewable power, but they use an inordinate amount of the renewable energy that is available, the fairness of that would be probably an ethical concern as well. And genuinely speaking, I'm just saying, what point is it that I can generate a 30-second video from a text prompt if I'm paddling a canoe down O'Connell Street? You know, like, do we need to be considering what we're putting this energy towards and what we're building with it a little bit more? Maybe Dave, you wanted to build that one?
I mean, I think you put your finger on it. You know, if you guide your behavior just by how much carbon you've injected into the atmosphere, that doesn't really allow you to balance it against, well, what were you using it for? Have you replaced another function? You know, so there's recent paper there was looking at, well, how long, how much energy is involved in a person sort of commuting to work and working over several days, the amount of energy they consume compared to the energy consumed to do something similar. So you need to look at those things in context, and I think that does add to the complexity. I think it'll be interesting to see how much that sort of comes through, if you like, the AI Act, where, as you say, it is one of the fundamental rights. There's, not only, perhaps doing that as part of your fundamental rights impact assessment, but perhaps do you also want to include that in the part of the Act that talks about best practice and communicating to your users? So perhaps you include something that says, okay, this cat video we generated for you took this many kilowatts. You decide whether you should have done that or not. So sometimes it makes sense for the organisation that's either providing or deploying the AI to make those decisions. In lots of applications, especially a lot of the ones that perhaps a lot of GPT is being used for at the moment, perhaps we need to, at least communicate clearly to the user what their responsibilities are, and perhaps they have to take that on, which is a little bit what we do with GDPR.
Yeah.
May I take 30 seconds here, because the AI Act does open the door for that as well. You do have places in the Act where first of all, we give a mandate to the Commission to work at standards, because we've realized that there are no standards, there is no measuring system right now for actually what it means energy efficiency in AI. But because we recognize the need for that and for the sustainability angle, then again, we have given through the Act the mandate to the Commission to look into that. And we also have reporting obligations for energy consumption for the top model. So again, we have opened the door in the Act for that discussion to start taking place.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to turn to the audience very quickly for questions. So if you can start putting your hands in the air and try and be concise as possible with your questions so we can fit a good few in. But while you're thinking of what you want to ask, Maeve, I did want to come back to that responsible AI projects that you work on, because there's a really interesting example there of one that you worked on with the Singapore Monetary Authority, and it was looking at these areas of like responsible AI. There was specific tenets you were adhering to in terms of
fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about that project?
Yeah. So that project, I mean, Singapore is often ahead in these things, and they've taken a slightly different approach to Europe in terms of. My understanding, unless it's happened very recently, they haven't passed specific regulation on it. But what they actually did is brought together a consortium of financial services companies, consultancy companies, startups. And actually, initially they did, I think in 2018, they published principles. And then they actually then brought this consortium together to help write methodologies for each of them. And importantly, along with the methodologies, also a separate document with use cases. So for each of the methodologies defined, actually a use case where you took data, you took a use case, you ran it through whatever you defined in the methodology, like say for fairness, how you do a trade-off between how fair the model is versus, the economic or sort of commercial impact that you're looking to get. And so that was done with a consortium. So that was in 2020. 2, I think that was published, but like I worked on the fairness methodology piece. But even since then, they have open source toolkits and everything. So from the point of view of startups you were talking about earlier, I think it's the more that you can get very clear on standards and toolkits and sort of help to walk through these smaller companies that wouldn't have the huge teams of data scientists or AI or lawyers to actually help them work out how they can comply with, in this case, it isn't regulations, but do the right thing, I guess.
And just on that, I mean, I suppose it's easy for me to sit here and say, you know, we have all of these teams and we're a research lab from the beginning and it's fantastic and it's great. But for those smaller companies, it's such a massive challenge. And what I would say is, you know, context is king. It's so important to understand, truly understand how you envisage applying it. And it's hard because you have to almost be master of microscope and telescope, you know, master of what you're doing right now, but also master of how you plan to do it in the future. And that's really hard. So I think when you see initiatives like that you've talked about, I think for smaller companies, it's so valuable.
And I like it as an example of how you can take steps towards responsible AI outside of the EU AI Act. It's not that the EU has to only be taking these steps and making these steps towards regulation and responsible AI. It is happening elsewhere. There is interest elsewhere. So do we have any questions? Yeah, I can see just this lady down the back with her hand up. So I think that's definitely a question for you, Dragos.
The question is absolutely yes. The AI Act is all about that. So, of course, various companies have used, depending on their own moral code or constitution or whatever they call the principles that they base their development on, they had their own self-restraint and their own methods of measuring bias, of making sure that the products they were putting on the market were, from their point of view, as fair as possible, and responding to what they thought were the expectations of citizens. What we're doing is now metrics. What we're doing now with the AI Act is we're providing the standards so that we don't have a company that thinks that this is how best to serve accuracy and at the same time non-bias versus other company who would say, well, I actually take a different route, which is still not taking away the complexity of actually coming up with a standard for measuring bias. Probably this is the most complicated standard that we'll have to figure out. But there will be standards for all of these things.
And I think Dave definitely has something to say on that.
Yeah, I might add to that. I mean, you know, there are already standards being worked on at the international level about measuring bias, and there are techniques for doing that. But I think it's really important to understand that it's, you know, that we can, you know, essentially the standards can define the structure of the apparatus, okay? They are not, and they know that they're not, and they won't undertake the job of actually saying what factors are we actually checking for bias and what is the acceptable threshold. That, my feeling is, has to be done, at least in the context of the AI Act, at a sectoral level. So, you know, in education, in healthcare, you need to bring in the experts and the stakeholders to make those decisions. And we need the networks to have those conversations. They're probably all using perhaps the same, you know, underlying algorithms for bias, which are based on the state of the art, but if you like, the variables that you put in need to be agreed at a sectoral level.
Yeah, and just one thing, again, going back to the fairness methodology that we developed for Monetary Authority of Singapore, like the way they had what they called personal attributes. It's different than personal data, it's wider than personal data. And we had 3 different ways you looked at the potential attributes that went into your model. One was, is it illegal to use them? And obviously you don't use them. But then the second was, from a societal point of view, is it considered okay or not okay. And that's a judgment call, obviously, for the bank or insurance company at the moment. And then it's based on your company's sort of principles and your mission statement and your value. Is it correct to use it or not? So, for example, say for a loan, like a bank might say they're very family centered, and so they don't want to use the fact that somebody has one child, no children, or 10 children to decide whether or not they should get a loan. So they decide themselves. So that's a personal attribute that they decide. We're not including that in our models because it's not aligned with our values as a family-friendly bank. So it's quite nuanced. And then there's also, like, say, gender. Say for insurance, in some companies you can't use gender at all. In some countries you can't use gender at all. But in others, based on the risk, say for car insurance, we're actually quite happy to say women get cheaper car insurance because they've got lower risk. So it also depends on the society you're in. So it's very difficult to actually come up with specific rules for each.
Because it's living and breathing, isn't it? The whole time in terms of these metrics. I think that's the important thing to remember, and not just for our models, but every kind of model out there is getting better and better and better, and more accurate, etc. So I think that's important to acknowledge as well. Those metrics are kind of living, breathing as well.
That was an excellent question, by the way. We go to this gentleman here.
Hi, my name's Steve from Redmond of Bearing Point, Ireland. I used to work with Medb actually in Accenture and worked in some responsible AI programs. Thinking about integrity and fundamental rights and workers, Bearing Point, we have nearshore resources in Bucharest. We have offshore resources in India. They are information workers who are going to get impacted by this technology. So how do we manage that? Because people say, well, we need to move workers up the food chain, but the food chain is a triangle. There isn't as much room at the top as there is down at the bottom. So how do we manage for the workers that we have in the EU on that? But do we also have a moral responsibility to workers in India and other offshore locations that we've been pushing work out to?
Well, if I'll dare an answer there, we have a moral responsibility for all of them. That's why we've attempted the due diligence discussion as well. And there are actually a lot of, I've heard all sorts of estimates but it goes into the hundreds of millions of workers already now who are doing the very, from my point of view, ugly work of actually showing models, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a giraffe, or it's not. So there are already, on the back of AI, a lot of ugly, bad jobs, which are most likely not going to be done here in Europe, nice and fancy, are going to be done in different other corners of the world, where in many other industry, the ugly work is being done. So yes, there is a moral responsibility that we bear also for them. But looking also now in our own backyard, yes, AI is going to produce, as I also said earlier, a massive change also in terms of what it means for the jobs of today and certainly for the jobs of tomorrow. Some of them will be replaced altogether, rendered completely irrelevant, even if maybe today they are very valid for what they do, but very likely AI is going to replace them. So the first question is, what do you do with them? How do you reskill them to reintroduce them in the value chain, in the triangle or not, doesn't matter, but how do you reintroduce them there? And what kind of skills and whose responsibility is it to make sure that they have the proper programs in place to reskill the existing labor force to adapt them for tomorrow? And it's not only about the jobs that will disappear. From my point of view, almost all intellectual input jobs are going to be somewhat touched by AI, to a smaller or to a greater extent, which means that they will have to learn how to integrate AI into their work, whatever work it is, whether lawyers or whether librarians or whatever they are. So that's a second level of discussion to be had. How do you train the ones that are not losing the jobs, but who need to learn how to use AI in it? And then there are new jobs that are going to be created. And this is where I don't think it's necessarily a triangle. Because just like with every other new technology that has changed the world in the past, yes, some jobs disappear, but there's always a plus. In fact, when you draw the line, usually so far at least, it's always been a plus. Because there'll be new opportunities, new jobs that we cannot even think of right now. Who would have thought 3-4 years ago that there will be a job that will be called prompt engineer? Now there is. Quite valuable, I guess. Pretty much like code writers were some years back. So there'll be a new set of opportunities in terms of the job market. But for all of that, you need a rethink of the education system and the skills that you're instilling in your students today to be fit for tomorrow, and also a massive program of reskilling for the existing labor force.
I should just say you should watch on the, maybe for Leaving Cert students in a few years' time, you know, there may be on the CEO forums prompt engineering degree courses or, you know, genuinely, and it's this notion of, who knows, I'm just putting it out there, but, you know, this notion of job transformation, of course, is key. And, you know, when you think back, you know, the birth of the internet and the concern, the true raw concern that this was going to, you know, dispel so many jobs, you know, and of course, look what's happened. So I think to that third point, that really speaks to that.
And I might add to that, I think, you know, there's something that's very close to our heart in universities is looking at the interaction between, you know, this, to a degree, some degree of automation around knowledge work and its impact on professions, you know, so lawyers, doctors, academics, journalists, you know, all our jobs are being changed. And I think one of the things we have to be really aware of is how that's being changed using data that we've generated but we've made publicly available. So, you know, in academia, we make a load of our stuff available open source. Very good example, I think, is Copilot and software, where people made a lot of their software available open source on platforms like GitHub. It's now being used to help automate their profession, and a lot of people get a lot of benefit out of that. You know, we yet to see how it'll impact their jobs, but we don't get a lot of say at the moment in that. And I think, you know, some of our intellectual property law and how we assert that doesn't marry up very well to the groups of knowledge workers who will be impacted by it. You know, it's usually done by some third party, like, you know, GitHub or Shutterstock or someone like that. And I think that's something that, you know, so we don't want any more legislation, but that is something where I think that does need to be addressed. And perhaps the Data Governance Act could be a good platform for doing that, and probably a little bit of looking at intellectual property and copyright law as well.
Yeah, probably since we've had now the focus on the AI Act for so long, and now it's taking great steps forward, there's now need to look at some of the other legislation and how that actually encompasses AI, because it touches on so many things. I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm sure there's so many more questions, but we've run over, and I'm sure you all need a break as well. But do talk amongst yourselves, talk to these guys when you catch them on the fly, and have a great rest of the day.